Welcome, everyone. This is The Writing Life. I'm Stephen W. Long. And, you know, I was thinking there's somewhat of a challenge to have a steady supply of guests. Are there really that many writers? And in Little McMinnville, it turns out that there really are. I heard about my guest, Jim Gullo, from a friend who heard Jim speak, and I want to talk about that a little bit. And I think it amazes me that you can look somebody up on Facebook, write to them out of the blue, try to assure them that you're not a stalker, and get them to come on the show. And that's what we got Jim to do. So first off, Jim, let's talk about the talk that my friend saw, and we'll get into the writing here in a minute.
Sure. That was a talk that Linfield asked us to do. I had been commissioned by Ken Wright, the wonderful winemaker in Carlton,
Sure.
to do a really cool project. About 2 years ago it started. He wanted to know what had happened on the land that are now his vineyard sources, some of which he owns, many of which he leases, and has done for 20, 30 years. And Ken is a real keen history of, or student of history, especially in Oregon. So he said, go back and find out, you know, who lived there, what happened on these lands before. And I thought that was pretty tall order and was going to be tough to do.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, there's a lot written about this. And if you do some sleuthing around, you find out some pretty neat stuff. Like the first flock of sheep to ever be successfully driven across the plains, you know, without being eaten by either the pioneers themselves,
right,
or the wolves along the way, wound up at the Canary Hill Vineyard in outside of Salem, which is one of Ken's prominent vineyards. And then just these wonderful stories of people's lives, you know, for the last 175 years. In 1847, a family called Gilliam came across the plains, had a horrific journey. Andrew Jackson Gilliam and his wife Sally and 3 kids under the age of 7, and were attacked numerous times, their train of wagons. Their own sheep were swallowed whole by wolves, didn't make it here. Well, they arrived in October of 1847 and thought they'd take refuge at the Whitman Mission, which many people did. That was a big kind of sanctuary, well known to the settlers. And Sally didn't like it. They got to the mission. Bob, something about the atmosphere didn't sit well with her. She demanded that they leave. So they left. They went and settled the land that is now the Freedom Hill Vineyard outside of Monmouth. And a month later, everybody at the Whitman Mission was massacred.
Really?
Yeah, terrible.
Like a premonition.
Yeah, possibly. Or just great luck and coincidence. Anyway, stories like this came up over and over as we looked into the backgrounds of the 13 vineyards that Ken works and makes his, you know, fabulous wines out of that are very well known and recognized. And when we think about the Oregon wine industry, you know, we think of it as a 50-year thing. It started 50 years ago, right, when David Lett planted the first Pinot Noir in Dundee, the Dundee Hills. But of course, the land usage goes way back. And when you start finding the pioneers and people who lived there and scratched out their livings, went through these boom and bust cycles of farming, you know, sometimes they did great at prunes for many years. In the 1920s, prunes were huge here. And then everybody had a prune dryer if it didn't burn down every other year. And then the prune business started to fade away, and they put cherries in. They did very well at cherries. Every Manhattan cocktail in New York City with a maraschino cherry,
right,
you know, could thank Oregon for that. Well, the cherry business did great for a while, but then foreign competition. And I even found out that labor was a tough problem for them as they got into this further. They couldn't get the fruit off the trees
really
in a cost-effective way. And so they were scratching, trying to make a living at that. And then in 1962, on October 12th, I believe it was, the Columbus Day windstorm, the worst ever storm outside of a coastal area, worst ever in the history of the United States,
really?
Blew through this valley, 100-mile-an-hour winds, blew everything all to heck, and knocked down trees and just destroyed farms. So if you had a farm that was scratching along on October 11th and barely making it, you were out of business on October 13th
Right.
of that year. And then, you know, the Oregon wine business and the plantings by the likes of David Lett and David Adelsheim came up 10, 15 years later. So this little dormancy period when they were trying to figure out what to do with that land in the hills that wasn't really agriculturally viable. And now this vineyard industry has sprung up.
Right.
It's world class. Anyway, we did a talk at Linfield about this, this history, the people who came before in the vineyards, and it was really nicely received.
And I don't know your relationship to Ken Wright, but I know a little bit about you, and you have a journalism background, so I suspect that this research that you needed to do came pretty naturally.
It came somewhat naturally, yeah. As a kind of outcome of my career, I've been writing for a living for 30 years. Since I turned 30 years old, said, darn it, I'm not going to do a real job anymore. And I am going to try to make a living at writing, and knock on wood, I have managed to do that.
Great.
And that has taken on many forms. I did study journalism at the University of Arizona, but I also minored in creative writing. I wasn't quite sure which side of the fence I wanted to land on. And as it turns out, I've done both, and both almost simultaneously for this whole period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of travel writing, a lot of magazine writing, a lot of profiles of people, and what I will call straight journalism. So yeah, that led to some research skills and ability to sleuth out stories.
Okay. We have several examples now. Trading Manny is nonfiction?
Yes, Trading
Okay.
Manny is a memoir about teaching baseball to my son about 10 years ago. My son Joe, who is a very bright 7-year-old, and as we found out, as Joe is growing older, he's now about to turn 17, Joe always got into things in a big, in-depth, dramatic way.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was baseball and baseball cards, he was just mesmerized, and he started memorizing statistics and you know, asking me, you know how many doubles Eddie Murray had in 1983, Dad? And I'd say no, but Joe did.
Yeah.
And he memorized Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams and Babe Ruth and you know, all of these eras of baseball just really talked to him. But at the same time, it's 2007. The Mitchell Report about steroid use in baseball comes out. Joe's a bright kid, and I didn't bring this up with him, but he brought it up with me. You know, it says on ESPN that these baseball players, who he's really following, are using drugs. You know, why are they doing that, Dad? Well, I don't know. And at first I thought it was just a childlike question, but it really was a kind of consuming problem he was dealing with. Is this little kid falling in love with baseball? And he started asking me all the time, why'd they do it? Does it really make you better? Is it bad for you? Why is the game letting them do it? Mm-hmm. And so I realized as months went by that these were important questions, and I started recording them and recording how we would talk about baseball. And then I started taking him to try to get answers. You can't really march up to Ken Griffey Jr. or Barry Bonds and ask them, but you know, we asked other people around the game. We started talking to minor league ball players who I met through my journalism career. I happened to be writing a story about the then Portland Beavers AAA ball club.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Right when Merritt
Russell.
Paulson had bought the team,
Right.
And they were an affiliate. Wow, my memory's fading on this one. I think of the Padres. Anyway, I met several ball players, and one I very luckily befriended, who was writing his own book. His name was Dirk Hayhurst, and he was a very successful relief pitcher. And we became friendly, and so we talked about this. You know, if ball players are taking drugs to get better, well, why don't you? If you want to get to the major leagues,
Sure.
You know, how do you make this decision? And he talked to us about it, and he talked to Joe about it. And then Joe and I talked to doctors, and we traveled around, and we made it a baseball journey. We went to see the Idaho town and field where Walter Johnson,
Oh,
the
really?
great Walter Johnson of the 1910 to 1920 something, Washington Senators, had gotten his start and was a young phenom before making it to the major leagues. And there's Walter Johnson commemorative fields and even a museum with several artifacts. So anyway, it was a way to talk about baseball. And we ended up interviewing Scott Brocious here, who was a great major league ball player and wonderful coach and manager here at Linfield, very graciously, because believe me, nobody wanted to talk about this, nobody in the game, but Scott sat down with us. Joe asked him about it. Why did players do it? Scott said, well, they had their own reasons, and it wasn't something that I was ever really aware of or wasn't confronted with. And he framed it in a very nice way,
What a great education.
Yeah, and so for Joe, it was cool. It was a way of realizing that baseball was more than, the great stories that we all know and we all gather and become part of our common cultural history. And at the same time, it had this kind of grown-up context of there's a shadowy side and a dark side that they were still figuring out how to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, Trading Manny got published by Da Capo Press in Boston, 2012, I think. And it was wonderful. When you publish a book like that, all kinds of weird stuff just comes across your transom. A package arrived in the mail one day, and it was an autographed copy of the Mitchell Report by Senator George Mitchell.
Oh my gosh.
Saying, "Keep up the good work, Jim and Joe."
Yeah.
Which is what a cultural artifact that is.
Sure.
And another guy emailed me. Must have been an elderly gentleman. He said, "I live in a retirement community in Florida, and I want to take your book to one of my neighbors. Would you mind? His name is Sandy Koufax." I was like, "No, of course I don't mind."
Being
Do
from
that.
Southern California, I remember Sandy Koufax.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And, Dale Murphy, a wonderful ball player, and one of probably Oregon's best ever ball player, wrote a nice blurb endorsement of the book that's on the cover.
Yeah.
So anyway, this stuff happens, and as it turns out for me in writing the book, it really becomes a father and son story. It's a parenting journey that I took with Joe.
All right.
From the ages of 7 to about 9. And it was wonderful,
Okay.
that we could undertake this.
Well, I'm going to do a little housekeeping here.
Okay.
And let Carolyn know you have to leave in a little bit, but we've got a lot to talk about. So Carolyn, I'd like this to run a little bit long, and that's going to be okay, I hope, with everyone.
Sure.
I do want to get to The Comedy Keeper. This is your latest book. You graciously gave me a copy. I loved it. And before we got started, you were talking about the age group that's the target. So why don't we back up a little bit and talk about how you started with Grouch Bag.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I have 3 sons. They
That could be a show, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think it was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you need a crotchety old uncle, though.
Okay.
I have to find that before I can do it. My sons are 28 years old, 17 years old, and 8 years old.
Okay.
And so we've had this range of books. We've been reading boy stories for years and years. And I'm a great student or just a fan of comic history. It's just one of those things that has always talked to me. And a lot of my work has a comic
Right.
voice. And in fact, that was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me as a writer is I started writing magazine articles. I was living in Hawaii at the time, and people started sending me off to do articles. And you can do those stories in a first-person way and put a voice on it. And the voice for me was always comic. It was humorous.
Now, well, let's back up a little bit because I think you're skipping ahead. If
Oh, yeah.
I got your bio right, you actually started this in high school.
Well, in high school, I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I would write articles for the school newspaper that were just kind of straight stories or interviews.
Right.
But I'd go home at night, and then I'd write parodies of the same
Of
articles.
your own story.
Yeah, of my own stories, and show them to my friends.
Sure.
And we'd all get a laugh about it, and that was more fun.
You're so subversive.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what you can do as a humorous writer.
Yeah.
Is you can take your shots from the comfort of your living room,
Right.
where your Smith Corona is, and then show it off to the world and
Right.
and duck and cover behind it.
But now
Well,
you did this as a travel writer as well.
yeah, as a travel writer, I was then able to travel all around the world writing narrative stories about my trip to seek out the best hot sauces in the Caribbean, to play all the golf
Rough
courses
duty.
of Scotland
Yeah.
as a P.G. Wodehouse character, in the guise of P.G. Wodehouse character, whose work I always adored.
Sure.
Right, and so I could write these long things, and they were funny, and they were very personal. But that was my voice. I found it early, and was very pleased that I did. And that's what I've always tried to bring to my work. Well, I had an idea a few years ago, typical writer, here's an easy thing. It'll take me 2 months to write. What if there has to be a catalyst for comedians to start their careers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, you read biographies of comedians, and they all had something happen.
Something.
They decided, that they had to be funny, or they were going to do this for a living. But what if that catalyst wasn't as apparent as that, and it had to come from somewhere? And I thought, I'm going to send a kid who's the class clown, the wise guy of his class, back in time, and he's got to convince somebody to start comedy, or else the whole career that we know of won't have happened. All right, typical time travel
Right.
scenario. And I chose the Marx Brothers. I love the Marx Brothers. And I wanted to perpetuate the Marx Brothers' work and knowledge of them to an audience of today's readers, today's funny kids,
Right.
So I hadn't tried to write a book for, let's say, a 12-year-old, 12 to 15-year-old reader. But I thought, this is going to be it. I am going to write this time travel book. Kid goes back in time. He's got to convince the Marx Brothers to take up comedy. And so it brings together some historical research, quite a bit actually. I read everything I could about the
Yes,
Marx Brothers.
yes.
And I wanted it to be accurate, and it is, down to the details of where they lived and the clock they saw out the window of their apartment on East 92nd Street in New York City.
Let me interrupt you there. I know that you've got a blurb on the back by one of the sons.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Was he a source of information as well?
No, not at
Okay.
all. After I wrote the book, I kind of got in with a group of Facebookers who are
Okay.
crazy avid Marx Brothers fans, and one of them messaged me and said, Bill Marx is not only still alive, but he goes under a pen name on Facebook. Why don't you contact him? And I did, and I found him, and I said, can I send you this book I wrote about your dad, Harpo
Right,
Marx?
right.
Bill Marx is Harpo's adopted son. And that was fairly nerve-wracking, that I've written this book about Harpo Marx
I
at
can
about
imagine.
15 years old,
Yeah.
and his brothers, with their voices and with their families and their biographies pretty well intact. And, can I send it to you? And he came right back to me and read it and said, this is wonderful, provided a wonderful blurb for
You
the
bet.
back of the book. And that's one of those treasured moments of writing. It's right up there with Sandy Koufax.
Yeah.
Well,
I love the whole book, but I particularly liked Julian, who is Groucho. His
Julius.
voice, the way
Julius.
that you do his voice. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just that's Groucho.
Well, yeah. I mean, we all know Groucho from of course his movies, but also watching interviews of him as I did growing up, and listening to stuff and watching You Bet Your Life, and trying to get that cadence. And I even ran this book past a guy in New York City who's a professional Groucho impersonator.
Really?
Yeah, because it was important to me. I wanted to get it right, and I wanted people who knew the Marx Brothers or loved them to feel that the book was authentic enough and honored them. in the way. So anyway, I sent it to Noah Diamond, who's a historian in New York City, and he played Groucho in a revival of a Marx Brothers play last year, and he came right back and said, same thing. This is good. I really like the voice. He made a few small suggestions that I incorporated into changes.
Okay.
So that was cool.
Now, we got off the topic a little bit.
Yes.
So, did you have a target audience in mind?
Well,
or you just wanted to write this book and...
Yeah, I just wanted to write this book, and I wanted it to be for kids, and I thought I would play it to that young adult or middle grade, as they call it in the industry, audience. And so I wrote a book, and I called it Grouch Bag. Here's a copy of Grouch Bag, and
Jim, hold that up just a little higher.
Oh, do we see it? Okay.
Yeah, there you go. That's
so
it.
Grouch Bag came out a year or two ago, and I self-published it because I kept getting, when I presented it to the professional world of publishing, I kept getting, it's such a neat idea and it's so well written, but we're not sure that it's appropriate for the age group. It's over their heads and the kids don't know who the Marx Brothers are. And I said, well, who cares? It's a story about a kid who meets some very funny guys. Anyway, it's so frustrating sometimes to deal with the publishing world of literary agents and the glacial pace of all that.
Right.
And you can self-publish a book now. You and I could go home tonight and have a book done by midnight and ready to print. Anyway, I self-published Grouch Bag. And then when a year or two went by, and I designed the cover and everything myself, and then I thought, well, I want it to be more appropriate. I want it to really speak to the audience of kids who it's intended for. So almost as a trial thing here, I have republished it, totally new cover, totally new book ISBN number, and new marketing materials, everything. I even...
now the content is the same.
Is word for word the same. So if anybody has bought Grouch Bag, I pray that they won't buy The Comedy Keeper too and be sorely disappointed. But yes, so The Comedy Keeper is now out there. It's available in all bookstores. It's in standard distribution. And hopefully we'll speak to that young audience. And in fact, next week, I've been invited to go back to New York City to the neighborhood and speak to a middle school.
Oh, how wonderful.
In the same neighborhood where this book takes place.
You sort of touched on this, and I want to follow up, because when I read the book, I had this in mind. I love the protagonist's voice. And you didn't, he's a kid, but you're not talking down to your reader. You're bringing the reader up to that level. And I wanted to mention that, so I'm glad that you jogged my memory. I thought
well,
that was,
thank you. Yeah,
and that's a hard decision.
Well, and that's what a lot of knocks on this kind of book is that they're grown-ups talking down to kids and talking in a kiddie type voice.
Which you didn't do.
No, and I think the kids I know are pretty serious people trying to find their way in the world, even if they are funny and goofy and do kid-like things, And so I wanted this kid, Josh, to be on task, and he's thrilled to be meeting these Marx Brothers, but he also, he has kind of a mission to accomplish. And he's also realizing, this is another problem of time travel books for children. They rarely say, oh my God, I'm 100 years away from my own time. I don't know how to get back. I don't know how to navigate the subway.
Right.
I don't know the mores and the social standards of the time. And in my book, he's chased by a policeman and he's grabbed, and he's even at one point...
It was a little bit shocking.
Yeah, he's shanghaied to the textile mills of upstate New York to work, which happened, Kids got sent away and were never seen again, and that's where they were.
Right.
They were workers. And I researched that stuff, and I made sure that was accurate. So Josh, it started out with, Josh is going to go back in time, he's going to meet the Marx Brothers, have a few laughs, tell them the importance of them becoming comedians. Because at one point, they weren't sure themselves, of course.
Right.
They were singers. Their mother was a terrific stage mother, and she said, you are going to have the singing act, and you do not stray from it. They had to really push to introduce comedy into their act. and it took years. Anyway, that was the initial conception of the book, but it wasn't interesting enough. Josh, having gone back to New York City of 1908, needed to have some problems thrown his way.
Yeah. Well, I don't. This is not a spoiler. I don't want to give anything away, and it would be so easy to do that. But I can tell you that I enjoyed the book, and I want it for my grandkids. So there's a span there. Now I think my grandkids are pretty sharp naturally, but they're going to get it. They're going to get it, and I so admired how you did the voice particularly. I like the relationship of the young people. Mm-hmm. Reminiscent maybe of a little Spielberg take on that.
Yeah, sure.
I
All the
thought.
kids in E.T. riding their bikes around the neighborhood and kind of figuring out how are they going to solve this problem amongst themselves without really going to adults.
Yeah. And when Josh goes away, they don't forget about him.
Yes.
Yeah,
and they kind of figure out. And I did a fun thing with typesetting. I made up a thing where the kids found an old typeset, hot what do you call it? Hot key?
Hot lead?
Hot lead, set up in the back of an abandoned warehouse in McMinnville.
Sure.
And the book takes place in McMinnville.
Well, that was fun too.
Yeah, I thought I'd set it here just because I know McMinnville and it's fun, and
Yeah.
Patton Middle School's in it, and even
Well, you've got some local characters
well,
too.
yeah, Jenny Berg,
Yeah.
our librarian, has a couple of
Little
lines.
cameo.
And
Zach,
yeah,
Gary.
a cameo. Yep, and Zach Gary, that's right.
Yeah.
Him, my pal Zach, who
Yeah.
I play ping pong with.
Okay.
Yeah, I threw him in there too. Anyway, I had the kids figure out how to contact Josh in 1908 by using the real text letter.
Well, I love that. Yeah, and I'm trying to think what's the line that you don't want to cross. So we don't think time travel is real. I mean, really, you and I don't believe that, and yet you buy into that as the conceit of the book. And so within that, now what? Now what can you do? How far can you take this?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought the texting was a great way to do it.
Well, yeah, when you start playing with that kind of conceit, you have to be consistent. You have to create the world.
In that world.
Yes,
Yeah.
the world has to make sense.
Yeah.
And it has to work, or else you're jumping the shark, to use a modern phrase.
Right.
So that took a lot of work, a lot of rewriting, a lot of showing it to friends.
Sure.
And even now, I sent it to my cousin last week, and he said, "Boy, this book is good. How'd the Marx Brothers get a car?" And I said, "They just did, all right?"
I could comment on that, but not on the air. And I know you have to go, so we're going to wrap it up. But thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, lovely talking with you. Thank you for having me.
Folks who are watching, if you're looking for something fun to read, if you have some younger person in your life, boy, get The Comedy Keeper. They're going to love that.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Writing Life. I'm Stephen W. Long. Write to me at my website, stephenwlong.com, and hope to see you next time. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, that was really fun.
Good.